Across the state, erosion is eating away at our pristine shorelines. Beaches are starving for sand, whether it's from rising sea levels or large waves that batter our coasts. And experts warn it will only get worse. So is there a way to address the issue that all sides can agree on? Or will our disappearing beaches force both land and life to retreat? This live broadcast and live stream of KΑKOU, Hawaii's Town Hall, starts now.
Aloha and welcome to KAKOU, Hawaii's Town Hall, live from the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Multimedia Studio. I'm Yanji Denise. Hawaii's beaches are some of the most beautiful in the world, from the black sands of Ka'u on Hawaii Island to long stretches of white sand along Oahu's windward side. They are the places where local families come together on the weekends, where couples exchange their wedding vows, the destinations that tourists dream of when planning their vacations to paradise. Our beaches are the very essence of what makes Hawaii, Hawaii, and we are losing them faster, perhaps, than most of us realize. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, 70% of beaches on Kauai, Oahu, and Maui are undergoing long-term erosion. Maui has the dubious distinction of leading the group, with 85% of the island's beaches eroding. Global warming has led to sea level rise. By the end of this century, which is not that far away, we could see an increase of over 3 feet. In the meantime, we are already feeling the effects, with once robust beaches reduced to ribbons of sand, homes falling into the ocean, and roads in some areas flooded again and again or even washed away. KAKOU means all of us, as in we are all in this together, and on this issue we truly are. We want to hear from you in our discussion tonight. You can email or call in your questions. We're also streaming live at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaiʻi Facebook and YouTube pages. In our town hall tonight, we have a leading climate scientist, government and business leaders, planners and engineers, cultural practitioners, and community stakeholders. So let's begin. Lauren Blickley is here from the Surfrider Foundation. Your organization has done a lot of work looking at the North Shore, and I think this issue in particular came to focus for a lot of folks who perhaps don't track it about a year ago when a home along the North Shore fell into the ocean and made a lot of news. Tell us about what you're finding along that coast.
Yeah, so we started the North Shore Coastal Resilience Working Group about a year ago. And honestly, the development of that working group arose out of desperation, to be honest. You know, we're seeing our public beaches being lost. We're seeing a lot of illegal activity happening on the public beaches, on the shoreline. The state has an obligation and constitutionally obligated to protect our public shorelines. And it got to a point as a community of like, what can we do? And it's a really complicated situation. You know, this coastal erosion is like, when you're talking about plastic pollution, you can eliminate single-use plastics, or you know, there's these specific items you can take as an individual. But with coastal erosion, you kind of feel helpless sometimes. So the community working group really brought us together, and it put everyone in the same, you know, room and space to talk about what are the solutions. You know, what can we do? Where are the places we have to focus, and how do we address the issue of homes falling in the ocean while at the same time balancing the need for protecting our public and natural and cultural resources.
Tamara Paltin is here from the Maui County Council. You represent West Maui, which we know is very challenged on this issue. What are you seeing where you live?
We have about 9 condo complexes about to fall in the ocean. Majority of them are short-term rental investment properties. We have another building a little bit north of there, totally condemned and at risk of falling into the ocean. A lot of these are investment properties. The bigger, I mean, that's a big concern, but the bigger concern is our infrastructure. The lower road, there's a section right now that's about to fall into the ocean near Ka'opala Bay, and it has a charged water line under it right next to our gravity-fed sewer. And just to angle that section in around the back of about 20 houses, estimate last year was about 15 million. But the scary part is the whole stretch of road, like 8 to 12 miles, there's various points along the way, if you look at the sea level rise viewer, where it's gonna be possibly inundated by ocean water in the next 30 to 80 years. So trying to figure out CIP projects and the policy. We don't have like a managed retreat policy or adaptation pathway or exit strategy. So we're just kind of starting that discussion, hopefully this term.
Dr. Chip Fletcher is here from UH Manoa, of course, the interim dean of the School of Earth Science, Oceans and Technology. We talked about that 3.2 feet of sea level rise predicted by the end of the century. We hear about what's happening on the North Shore in West Maui, but will the state, how fast along the road to that 3.2 feet are we? And what will those impacts be like? Will it be equal across the state?
Oh, that's a great question, Yunji. We've been living with sea level rise for over a century, and it's been very slowly rising. We haven't really noticed it in terms of the various impacts that have been discussed here until very recently. Now, sort of the cumulative impacts are starting to crop up in areas where the erosion rate might be a little faster than other areas, where the wave energy is closer to the road and splashing up during high tides at various times of the year. And there's another part about sea level rise that few people are aware of, which is that landward of our shoreline, the water table will rise along with the ocean, sort of shooting the shoreline in the back, if you will, with flooding coming up out of the ground, forming wetlands in urban areas and in communities where obviously we have built because there was formerly dry ground. So sea level rise takes a lot of different forms, and a key issue with this, which was broadcast very loudly with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2021, is that sea level rise is a permanent condition now for centuries to over 1,000 years. We cannot unheat the ocean. We cannot unmelt the great ice sheets. This is a condition that characterizes our shoreline in perpetuity, and so it's incumbent upon us to figure out how to manage it.
Wow, okay. Michael Cain is here from the DLNR. She was talking about some of the illegal activities that we've seen. We know enforcement is so key, and we see people trying to save their individual properties. We understand that impulse, but we see illegal burritos that they're called, these black tubes filled with materials that to shore up the shoreline, illegal seawalls. We also see, even people dumping concrete right into the water fronting their homes along the North Shore. Where are we on enforcement, and what is it going to take to actually get these structures removed, or to make sure that people who do things like that are penalized?
One of the challenges we face is that there aren't many current solutions that we have for dealing with coastal erosion once it reaches a developed area. We know that if people build seawalls or even sandbag walls, it protects property and damages the beach. It breaks that cycle. We are moving forward on enforcement to try to get these sandbags removed. The challenge the state is facing is that we don't have a good plan yet for how to implement retreat. Tamara mentioned that we are just starting to talk about it. The state wants these sandbags removed, but then we face the issue of cesspools or houses falling into the ocean. So as we move forward, we find the challenge we're facing is we can solve one problem and create another problem, another environmental problem. And we don't have good solutions yet. The status quo is not tenable. Our solutions are not tenable.
Let's bring in Chris Conger here from Sea Engineering, Vice President of Engineering there. I want to talk to you about what can be done. One place that we have seen some success when it comes to replenishment is Waikiki, and we know that your firm had a lot to do with that. So can you tell us what they did there and whether that could be replicated in other places across the islands?
Well, as we all know, Hawaii is unique and diverse, not just in our culture, but in our coastlines and the environments around our coastlines as well. And beach nourishment worked very well in Waikiki, and there are other places in Hawaii where it can be a very effective midterm solution, and it can be something that's migrated with rising water levels as we move further and further into the sea level rise that's baked into our future. But there are a lot of other options that are out there as well. And as we look at coastlines, sandy and some that are more fluvial, that are estuarine or rocky. We're looking at a whole suite of different options. And to be honest, I'm optimistic with conversations like this, where we're bringing all the stakeholders together. We're bringing property owners and environmental advocates and scientists and administrators. And we have the opportunity to really discuss from a bunch of different perspectives which options, or preferably suite of options, might be appropriate, and especially as we phase them as our coastlines evolve with rising sea level and time.
So when we look at Waikiki, was that a solution just for Waikiki? When people see that, you see this, suddenly you have a lot more beach than you did a couple months ago. Can we do that anywhere else?
We absolutely can. And it will be effective in other locations, but I do want to caution that beach restoration is exactly what it says. We're rebuilding beaches. We're restoring them to where they were previously. And beaches, by their very nature, are dynamic and can be lost to big storms or tsunamis or major events. So it's something that we can do in the midterm, in the 10 to 20 year time frame, that's very effective, that brings back a natural resource, that restores function to our coastline.
Okay. There's restoration, and then there's this idea of managed retreat. Trinette, I'd love for you to talk about that with us tonight. Trinette Furtado is a community advocate on Maui and a Native Hawaiian cultural practitioner. Can you explain, for those who aren't familiar, what managed retreat is and what your thoughts are on that idea?
Well, managed retreat is, as it sounds, managing the movement landward of properties that are in jeopardy, of properties that are already past the point where we can do any kind of beach replenishment. My idea on that is that we do have to have some kind of managed retreat, but within that conversation, very important is to remember access to those areas, cultural access to those areas, gathering rights, because there are many families that still live further inland that continue to go and either gather food for subsistence living or practice protocols at these spots. And the more we look at, for instance, condos that are trying to do beach replenishment, and in that activity limit and restrict access, it becomes a very, very important and sometimes an incendiary point that can cause way more hassle in a community than if we have these kinds of conversations where we can talk about it, because in this entire conversation, the kuleana that we have to this aina and to practices long-standing before there were condos or hotels still needs to be an important facet of this conversation.
We have our viewers coming in, Laverne via Facebook writing in tonight, quit building close to the ocean. We need our beaches back. Do it. Easy plan, no further building. Write new building codes, no insurance available if not compliant. Matt Weyer, I want to bring you in on this. You're a council member that represents the North Shore. Just yesterday, the City Council took some action when it comes to setting back shoreline setbacks. Can you explain briefly to our audience what was done and what it hopes to accomplish?
Of course, and a part of that is, managed retreat, right? And I'll just note that, renourishment or replenishment of the beach at times and managed retreat aren't mutually exclusive, right? So we can look at sensitive areas, particular areas where we want to move sand, maybe do revegetation to restore dunes. But what the council did yesterday was pass Bill 41, which was increasing Oahu's shoreline setback to 60 feet. 60 feet is the baseline, and then there's a multiplier times the erosion rate if there's analysis on a particular parcel that can increase that setback up to 130 feet. And so what that's doing is kind of moving folks away from the shoreline, like the caller mentioned, right? But it's giving folks the ability to do repairs on non-conforming parts of their property. So if, say they have a home that's within that setback and there's damage to it, they can repair up to 50% or a portion of that non-conforming use up to 50% of the value, right? And so it's buying us a little bit of time, moving us in the direction of retreating from the ocean, knowing that, we're seeing these impacts, like was mentioned. Homes are falling into the ocean right now. On North Shore, you go around Ko'olaloa, you see the highway, the Kamehameha Highway being impacted by the ocean. And so this is kind of a first step. And the conversation is ongoing. The working group report, I think, was great, and I think everyone should read it. I'm sure most folks here have. Many participated in it, and this is just the beginning.
Okay, Kathleen Pahinui is on the North Shore Neighborhood Board. Interested to get your reaction to that idea of, the shoreline setback, but also what you're hearing from your friends and neighbors about this idea of managed retreat versus beach replenishment and people trying to save what they have or letting it go, and what that would actually look like.
It's a very complicated issue, and for me, it's also an issue of equity, social justice, and equity. You have a lot of local families that have lived on the ocean for many, many years. They don't have money like some of these people that have come from the mainland and bought up these shoreline houses and now want to dump burritos and things on the front of it. And so you have this kind of have and have not situation going on. So you have to deal with that. That's another issue you have to deal with. The gentleman whose house fell in, he wasn't a rich mainlander with millions of dollars. He was just a guy, that was his family home, had been there for 50, 60, 70 years. And it's difficult for him to do because he doesn't have the money. One of the things, I appreciate the council passing Bill 41, but I have to say, why does DPP then still continue to put out permits and approve SMAs, special management area permits, for people to build houses? It doesn't make sense. And Michael, I know you inherited this. We haven't met yet, but we will. But all of those folks at the burritos, the state didn't do their job. They didn't enforce. So thank you for the work that you're doing now. I know it's difficult and you're taking a lot of heat for it, but I appreciate it. It's not fair. People want to just dump rocks. The guy put cement on the beach. I mean, come on, that's just terrible. And then the poor guys that the family's been in for 20, 100 years, they can't do anything and they lose their home. So for me, I like what Tamara said. It's not managed retreat, it's an exit strategy. That's really what we have to look at, is an exit strategy here for everybody. And I don't know what that is, but I got to tell you, our community is pretty divided. We have the people that want, we got to save the homes, all these rich, fancy homes. And then you have people that say, well, it's just too bad. You bought, and as Dr. Fletcher said, the water's coming. We see it coming. And we haven't even touched really except on infrastructure.
Right.
Guess where all our infrastructure is?
Right along the coast. Let's go over to John Dean now. Of course, it's not just the North Shore, it's also across the island. We're going to go to you. You live in Waimanalo. You're a homeowner there, and you formed the Pāhonu Beach Community Restoration Foundation. We've talked a little bit tonight about some of the steps that individual homeowners have taken, much to the detriment of their community. Tell us about what your group is trying to do to help the shoreline.
Right, and I don't think there's going to be one shoe that fits all, and I do believe, and I think the shoreline owners along with me, and I've got a 5-generational family next door that's been there since the 30s. There's one solution that's going to work, and I think though that managed retreat in some areas you've got no choice. I don't see a managed retreat in Waikiki, and what can we do in working with it? Well, we hope, and we're in the beginning of the process and working with the DLNR, is really beach nourishment and trying to restore the beach to where it was. Now, I realize in 100 years it's not going to work, but in 100 years most of the properties will have aged out, and if we don't have any new construction there. But to the extent, at least this foundation we formed, is intent on trying to work with the community in coming up with a solution. And it's beach nourishment, but it's also groins, and there's some challenges with that. Can we do something, not just for the homes. I would tell you that that's a public beach, and if not just, that's full of people, more towards the Kailua side from where I live, because there's more sand. Where I am, there's little to no sand. So that's kind of what we're starting to do today.
We know that it's, of course, not just individual residential homeowners. Many commercial properties in our state are built along the coastline. Tourism, of course, is our economic engine. So we want to bring in Jeff Wagner, CEO of Outrigger. Your group, of course, owns properties not just around the state, really around the world. So I'm guessing that you face this in many places. But, you know, we talked about what's happening in West Maui, and we know that you have investments there as well. How is what is happening playing into your long-term planning, and what can the commercial side do on this?
Yeah, I think first, one of the things I wanted to mention, and Chip brought this up as well, is there's a lot of debate that happens across the communities on sea level rise. And I think we're all here because we're passionate and we see it and we know what's happening. And that debate, really, how do we subside that debate or get rid of that debate so that we can get past that and say we need action, we need to do some things. I think we all see that in the businesses in Waikiki, for example. It's clear, I've been here for 5 years now, and you see it. You actually know it's occurring, and there's a piece of us in the business community that's how do we get something to really happen? So the debate about sea level rise needs to stop. Now the debate about what to do needs to happen, and we need to start moving forward. I think that when you think about what's happening in a Waikiki, for example, the tourist is coming here for that beach. And if there's no beach, they're going to seek out other locations. With that becomes sentiment issues related to tourists because they end up seeking out Kailua or Lanikai or some of the other great beaches that we have across the state. So to me, the time for action is really now. I think the commercial teams within each one of the ownership groups is looking for solutions, and we're willing to step up to assist in the process.
What are your thoughts, you know, as a business owner on the legislation that the council just passed? Because that surely will impact a lot of commercial properties as well.
It will, and you know, there's the reality is when you've got shoreline setback issues, commercial businesses are going to potentially be hurt by that. And I want to look at other options. What are the other options that we can put in place rather than just pushing back shoreline or restrictions with, I guess building is one thing, but renovations or doing any type of remodeling to a property it gets sucked up into that legislation as well, and that becomes problematic for us. So it has an effect on tax revenue for the state if we're not able to do that. And so there are both sides of this that need to be looked at. There's a retreat scenario, there's a pushback from a building, how do we get something back into a more acceptable location, but there's another piece of it, it's there and it's still in existence, it's going to be in existence for a period of time, and when we're looking at a 60 or 70 year down the road scenario, we still have to deal with today.
Peleke Flores is here from Kauaʻi, Native Hawaiian cultural practitioner, also worked as an advisor for the Kauaʻi County Climate Adaptation Plan. What can we learn about the way that Native Hawaiians lived long before climate change was really on the radar of anyone, where they chose to build their homes and how that can inform us now?
For us, we're definitely still learning. To get a lot of catching up to do. But as we're breaking things down, a lot of our focus is kind of on the aquaculture, like our shoreline aquacultures, our inland, and especially if we talk about the homes, kind of break it down. Like I come from Waimea, Kauaʻi, and a lot of the stories before the riverbank was built, it was like a natural thing to know that the river always S, and there was like Kahawai in Hawaiian. And Kaha means to cut, and the Wai is the water. But the homes always moved when that happened, so nothing was as permanent, stuck in a place, and the people adapted with the environment. And same thing with the shoreline, Kahakai, the ocean that cuts. So like it wasn't homes were never stuck in one place and always adapted with it. And just within the Olelo, it shows that things always moved. We're only in a short time of, you know, all these buildings on the shoreline compared to the whole lifetime of the island, that we kind of set a fantasy of how the beach was supposed to look like and stay like, and trying to adjust to that when in naturality it always moved. So like, where is the steady point to the kind, and whose lens we looking at? Like for us, I don't know, like at least for me, I would say like a sandy beach is not always my best fantasy. It's like a productive kahakai is, where there's abundance of food, you can go, and the resources, and the surf, and yeah. But now this day and time, where as tourism became more bigger in Hawaii, the fantasy is the white sand beach. Like, you know, so like, how do we keep that image up in order to satisfy that new economy that's been bursting on our shorelines?
Okay, I want to bring in Jeffrey Overton, a principal planner with Group 70. There you are. You specialize in gaining land use permit approval. You know, have developers changed the way they are building either along the shoreline, if they are building indeed there, or changing, you know, where they're building, given the realities that we've talked about tonight?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Yunji. Over the last several decades, yes, there's been a change and more of an understanding of where we are along the coastline. As architects, planners, and engineers, we've actually got a real positive outlook on the future here for our shorelines. I know there are kind of gloomy scenarios with big sea level rise projected in some of the models that are out there. But as we look ahead to the future along our shoreline, we have many tools available to us to look forward to this. As you've heard, you know, we need to learn from good examples that we've seen here in state. We have a wonderful project where T-groins were built by Iroquois Point, which has really shown that you can stabilize a section of coastline and hold beaches. We've seen the structures in Waikiki. So retreat isn't the only answer. We've heard a little bit of that today. You know, we have such a varied coastline. The pictures of the North Shore, and I lived there for 15 years, that's a high energy environment and very sandy coastline. So there is that seasonal mobility, and those homes are at risk. And it's one of the beaches we call a legacy beach. So would we ever consider armoring that coastline? I'm not in favor of that. Would we take all the homes down and move, say, the first 75 homes in a row and just call it a new park? Well, it starts to raise some of these questions that our Coastal Zone Management Act, CZMA, the Chapter 205A, it calls for balance in this. So the beach is important, the environment is important, but also our communities and the economy are all part of that balancing act. So to answer your question, developers along the coastline, whether they're a resort development, we serve resort developers, we serve communities, as well as the state and county. Everybody has to think of the future here, and running for the hills isn't really the only option. We've seen the world adapt and be resilient with their designs, and that's one tool, but there's many tools.
Chip, what do you think some of the good tools are? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I'd like to make a comment on this idea of balance. So if you look back over the last several decades, 5, 8 decades, this idea of balanced coastal management has really governed the system. Coastal management occurs parcel by parcel. And when you look at a parcel that is eroding and you have a private landowner who is being threatened with land loss, the balance always tips in favor of the private landowner. And so we have a long, sad history of building seawalls to protect these parcels. Now, beaches belong to our children. It's where our families go. It's where children learn to swim. It's where they first hear the sound of the wind and the waves. They see clouds. Beaches are where Hawaiian children in Hawaii learn to be safe in the ocean. And it's how we learn to love the environment of Hawaii. But beaches have disappeared because of balanced coastal zone management. I'm sorry. Balancing just is not the nice, comfortable word that it sounds like. Now, I agree with everything that's been discussed here. Retreat is not the option in all places. I think Waikiki and a lot of other locations, we need to learn to live with water. But Chris Conger was very careful about identifying midterm solutions versus long-term solutions. And so this needs to be a scaled approach, because ultimately sea level is going to become a multi-meter problem. That is, it's going to hit 6, 10, 15 feet as we go out a couple of centuries. We can't forget that, even though for now, over the next couple of decades, there are places where beach nourishment can work, where increased setbacks in order to avoid further development of the shoreline in a hazardous area, where that can work. Really, it's a place-based toolbox with lots of different solutions And we're at that stage right now where we're transitioning into this very detailed discussion in order to figure out our pathway through this problem.
Chris, I want to bring you in. This is Dee from Oahu. She wants to know who paid for the renourishment in Waikiki, and if it's good for the hotels, what about other properties? Something like that has got to cost quite a bit of money.
It does cost some money, and typically these are cost share projects where there's a portion that's funded through the state, typically through funding that comes through like TATF taxes and allocated funds, and then a portion of it that's coming from the resort community as well. We're seeing the same thing in Kaanapali, where the Kaanapali operators are paying for half of it. These are great cost shares when you're talking about restoring a natural resource and doing improvements that are all state property. All these improvements, these are not private lands. These are state lands, they're state beaches, they're public property, and you're getting a great cost share. Yeah.
John, how are you going to navigate that? You've got this hui of homeowners. You don't have the pockets, I would imagine, that Mr. Wagner might and his cohorts there along Waikiki. So are you asking the state if and when you come up with a plan to put some money in, or how?
I'm going to do a collection tonight.
Yeah. Well, it's going to have to be a pretty big one, and we need those dollars here at PBS, so don't you try that. No, but in all seriousness, I mean, something like that is quite expensive. How do you navigate that? Do you try to get the state to pitch in?
I wish I had a quick answer, and I don't. There's a couple other projects going on right now in Waimanalo. Department of Transportation's looking at sand catcher, another beach nourishment project. I've just heard there's a third one going on in terms of more of nourishment. And why don't we all get together? So someone has said to me from the Waimanalo community board, or neighborhood board, why don't we talk about all these projects? So that's just beginning, but that might be a possibility. And then you're talking not just about our beaches that are public for everyone and doing better there. There's the Keona Park that's nearby. They could certainly use some help. So a combination might work. I don't have an answer because we're still working on it. The other is what can we do in our area? So it's a start. And we've been working with DLNR to come up with a plan. And so it is going to be expensive. It's not going to return the beach to where it was 40 or 50 years ago. And it's still only 8 properties. But now that we have it in place and the foundation established, we're talking to every homeowner along the way. Would you like to participate? Here's how it works. What do you think? And there's some that can't. You know, some families that are 5 generations, it's just, there's no way they can, but they still need to be included. So that's kind of where we are. So I can still take a collection at the end.
I'd actually like to expand the conversation a little bit. Peleke had mentioned the concept of kahakai, and tonight wasn't the first time I heard that, but it parallels what we've been seeing with the science, where when we have a natural shoreline, it's dynamic, it can move, we have a sandbank that can absorb erosion without damaging the oceanic environment. And there are decades where a coast will retreat or will accrete. That's part of the natural process. The problem we're seeing now is when erosion hits development, it's a crisis. Erosion itself, our islands have been eroding for millions of years. And I liked, you know, over dinner when he introduced me to the concept of kahakai, it matches what I'd like to see as more dynamic shorelines. So we talk about sand nourishment, and our office has participated in some rather large nourishment projects. I think we need to move beyond just putting sand on the beach and tying that in with some type of coastal restoration.
And I see you nodded your head. Please jump in.
Just, you know, when Chris Conger said it's a midterm solution, plenty of the local people in my community are adamantly opposed to the Kaanapali restoration. That environment is in jeopardy, and they don't want to see, you know, the Nabeta grounds or the Kona crab grounds be sacrificed to save the beach environment. But if it's a midterm solution and not a long-term solution, and you're reinforcing the beach so that the economy could continue to thrive? Is money being put away for the long-term solution? If Mr. Fletcher says we're going to see 6 meters and so on and so forth, beach erosion is not the permanent answer. At what point do we make the plan to take those things down? And when the environmental assessment for the Ka'anapali Beach restoration was on the DLNR agenda, the community came out in such force that it was pulled from the agenda. So I'm not sure what that is about. Like, why wasn't it just allowed the community the chance to give their testimony on that?
I want to bring you back in here, Kathleen. This whole,
I think
Michael, please, you can go ahead and
Well,
answer that
I
if you
just
feel
wanted
like
to
you want
clarify, the
yeah.
item that was pulled from the agenda was a cost-sharing agreement between the Operators Association and the state. It wasn't actually the EIS or the permit. So,
My bad.
no, it's okay. That's why I wanted to jump in. Just
No, and please feel free to talk amongst.
we will need to
talk-
hold public
talk-
hearings on the actual permit, and I.
Keep us posted.
Well, and actually, you know, Michael, I'll stay with you for just 1 second, and then we'll get to Kathleen. We have this one from Rosie, who says, the DLNR is quick to break up parties on the Kaneohe sandbar on holidays with multiple officers, but do nothing to remove illegal structures built, destroying our beaches. This is from Rosie. And you explained a little bit earlier that if you take those structures away, then maybe perhaps more damage is done. Is that what you're saying?
There is that potential. The bigger issue with enforcement is that it's a slow process. We have to build our case. We present our case to the Board of Land and Natural Resources, who makes their decision. And then landowners have the right to the legal term. Basically, we go through a contested case. They have the right to due process. And that can stretch out for 6 or 8 months. And for that, we need 2 representatives from the Department of Attorney General's office to represent, 1 for our office, 1 for the tribunal. So a single enforcement case consumes a lot of resources. So we do it 1 at a time, and we just are slowly working through our backlog of 60 cases.
Kathleen, you know, what are your thoughts on that when you think about, you know, that example of the concrete being poured in the ocean? He's up against a lot. That's a lot of red tape. Is there a way that you think that this could be better managed?
Yeah, our elected officials. I know, Michael, I'm sure you struggle with that, but I get it, due process, that's our democratic society. But at the same time, the beach is eroding, you have burritos littering the beach, and the beach is in the state constitution, it's part of the public trust. Nobody owns the beach. I don't care how much money you have, you do not own the beach. And when you litter it with burritos and concrete and stuff, you're basically thumbing your nose at the rest of the community. I hear what Jeff and everyone's saying about, you know, different options and things like that, but I also think we need to look at the larger community. The North Shore, 7 miles, is considered the most pristine surf places in the whole world. I don't surf personally, but you know, a lot of people do on the North Shore. People come to the North Shore for surfing. And maybe the North Shore is one of those areas where we just kind of have to see what nature does and maybe come up with solutions to help the people on the coastline. You know, I know we're hardening in groins and things in Waikiki, but maybe that works for Waikiki, but maybe it doesn't work for the North Shore. So I like the regional approach, like Chip said, this parcel by parcel doesn't work. We have to look at it bigger, and I think that's when we were doing the coastal that Lauren, that Surfrider did, is looking at it more globally, looking at it like longer stretches is what Councilmember is doing over in Maui.
Jeff Overton, I want to hear from you about this whole idea of managed retreat, because I know that it's not the same in all places. The coast is not the same in all places. In some areas, if we lose, you know, if we take away those structures, perhaps then there's no sand and then there's dirt and we have erosion. So what are, you know, when you look at that, taking the homeowners themselves out of it, not that that's, of course, a very important piece of this, but just looking at the sort of engineering side of all of this, is managed retreat possible everywhere?
So you make a good point. If you take a house that's built on sand and you take the house away or it's lost, you'll have sand, and then the beach will reestablish itself. If you're in a place such as West Maui or other areas where the backland is not sand, and it's our red dirt and soil, once that begins to get eroded, it's not beneficial to the benthic environment or the water that we love to swim and surf in. So each of these situations we have to treat uniquely. Our coastline is so different as you go around. Something like 6,500 beachfront properties around this island alone. So you can think of the headache that Michael has enforcing all this. But it is the shoreline in Hawaii Kai or Kaneohe is much different than where Kathleen and Matt are up on the North Shore. They're much more dynamic, much more different. So your question about how we could apply managed retreat, I think we have very good models that Chip and his group have developed, but they're kind of on a macro scale. And how we apply them in a localized thing, it really takes coastal engineers like Chris Conger's outfit to analyze each of them, look at the specifics of how the sand is flowing in that environment over time, and then consider these options. I think managed retreat is probably going to have to be considered in areas where it's inevitable, and we've just seen the failure of a couple of homes in those areas. It may not be timely and be placing really an undue burden on properties. You talk about families that have held these beachfront homes for 2-3 generations. They're being told now their home is non-conforming, so they really can hardly repair it, and it's intended to be lost over time based on this, I'd say, rushed policy decision to go ahead and impose these on these homeowners. So it's a bit of a burden on families. Not all of them are millionaires, most aren't. And I think we need to just keep tuning it, working together, talking through it, because this is the beginning of kind of a shared approach to how we manage this. And retreat is not the only answer.
Can I say something about retreat or managed retreat? Actually, I want to say two things. Chip and Peleke, thank you. So you guys, your comments just gave me chicken skin. I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old daughter, and it just, thinking about it from those perspectives is, I think, a reason why I'm here, and it continues to drive me. I also think the fact that we have to center Hawaiian cultural knowledge in this discussion is absolutely critical. So thank you for sharing your mana'o with us on that. I wanted specifically about managed retreat. It's such this decisive word, and it just feels like this one thing, right? We've even talked within the environmental community, do we use a different phrase? And then that was a whole discussion in and of itself. So I just went back to managed retreat. But I think it's important for people to understand that managed retreat is not one bill that you can pass. It's not one funding source. It is not one policy. It takes multiple funding sources from state, from county, maybe some of it's private. It's a lot of different opportunities, a lot of different bills. It's like, well, do we, have receiving areas where we actually move these homes or structures to another area that's safer, and so I think that's just an important thing that I wanted to bring up. It's like we're not just going to pass one bill that moves everything off the coastline, and that's not also what we're necessarily advocating for. There's some hot spots that, we need to get the structures off the beach yesterday, 10 years ago, but that there's a really good, I think, holistic way to look at all of these different areas like we've been talking about with different solutions to fit those areas.
Yeah, Chip, if we take those structures off the beach, what happens to the beach?
Lauren's making an extremely good point here. This idea of managed retreat seems to turn some people off, but if I'm standing on train tracks and a train is bearing down on top of me and I step to the side, I considered managed retreat to be a major victory in that case. And we are looking at a huge train bearing down on us. The idea that we need to slow down and study this more, that's an idea that was used by the tobacco industry. It's an idea that's used by oil and gas. This is called denial. And we are moving forward as a community. Next decade, the decade of the 2030s, the models are showing very clearly that we're going to be seeing king tides increase exponentially in frequency. By the 2040s, we're going to be looking at hundreds of homes around the state falling onto the beach, just like we've been seeing taking place on the North Shore. We are actually at the end of time to do this. So the idea of waiting makes no sense to me. there's a lot we can do. Lauren's description was very good, that there are many steps we're taking, and together they represent a bundle of increased safety for our community and preservation for the precious beaches that we have.
You know, Matt, I want to bring you in on this because you do have a diversity of people in your community that are facing this. And as has been talked about, some of them have a lot of money and some of them don't. And on a practical level, how would you implement something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is as everyone's talking about, that the problem we're facing is just going to continue to grow, right? Like right now, if you're looking at beachfront properties on North Shore, 28% of them are within 20 feet of the shoreline. If you know, Mr. Fletcher is talking about a rise of 3-4 feet, if sea level goes up just 2 feet, that's going to increase to 40% of our homes, right? So we're going to be facing more and more homes possibly falling into the ocean. When you look at hardening of the shoreline, Mokuleʻia, Haleiwa Beach Park have lost some 2,000 feet, I think it is, and that's not accounting for the seasonal erosion that occurs between Rocky Point and Sunset Beach. So it's clear that we need to act, right? And so we do need to start, whatever we call it, managed retreat, something else. We need to contemplate moving back from what we're going to be facing. But I think we do need to have the conversation about pathways for families that are affected by this, right? I was talking to Mr. Fletcher about this. You know, he pointed out how you might have a home owned by a corporation versus a generational home. And so we have to look at what are all the options available, because obviously it's going to be location specific, right? There's different needs in different areas. You know, do we look at what kind of relief could be provided that's maybe income based? What kind of relief could be provided through maybe looking at TDR, transfer development rights, where if you're within that sensitive area, maybe you can give, you know, to a developer outside that sensitive area your development rights, and you get, you know, payment for that, and it helps you relocate it. And as a community, looking at where are we going to be putting folks that are having to retreat, right? And so I think those pathways are important, looking at federal funds that are available. You know, FEMA has some that we can unlock when disaster strikes, like BRIC. We have, you know, hazard mitigation grant program. We need to look at all the resources. There's not one solution. I think everybody recognizes that. But ultimately, as was mentioned, at the end of the day, that beach access, that shoreline, doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to you. Under our Constitution, it belongs to all of us and the generations that follow, right?
Right, and I want to bring in Maui back to the conversation as well. There's a fisherman who's writing in, ask the panel to address shoreline access. Beach replenishment in Kahana and Ka'anapali just protects hotels. There isn't enough sand to replenish those beaches. I'd love to know what you have to say to the fishermen.
Yeah, listening to this, it's not just fishing, and it's not just the people at the shoreline. When we look at what's happening with coastal erosion, it's our wetlands that are being affected by it. It's areas that are inland, you know, because we need to really look at it holistically as a mauka to makai kind of flow and idea, because as things impact our shoreline and the residents there, and we're talking about money, there are other things that are happening just even 200 to 300 feet inward from that also are very important. And shoreline access for, as you know, I had mentioned earlier, not just our practitioners, but for fishermen is slowly becoming, as I'm looking at some photos here of sandbagging and you know, hardening, beach hardening. These things on the surrounding areas can actually take a beach away from those areas, and thus create this deficit of where the fish run and how much fish are there. If there are habitats where fish are growing, you know, all of these things are affected by shoreline hardening and beach replenishment. And within that beach replenishment, where's the sand coming from? There are many areas that people are wanting beach replenishment, but they don't have adequate sand. And so the areas offshore that we get sand from, if we get sand from inland, you know, all of these things have major impacts on all of us, on our entire community. So not just those that are in jeopardy of losing their shoreline houses and developments, but also those who generationally have used those areas, as I had mentioned, for subsistence gathering, those who use those areas for cultural practice. That is very important because there are still sites within those coastal zones now with a 3-foot rise. Much of South Kihei Road is going to be underwater. Many of the sites that we have along there that are being carefully cultivated right now will be underwater. And beach replenishment and shoreline hardening is not going to help that. And so it does need to be a little bit more holistic look at it. We have to take a step back than just 500 feet from where the water breaks. We really do need to include other voices that look at the watersheds and how that adds to our, our nearshore systems.
Peleke, I want to bring you in because we've talked a lot about Oahu and we've talked a lot about Maui, but not enough about Kauaʻi. Tell us about some of the work that is being done on Kauaʻi and what those conversations are like.
Yeah, I don't know enough around the whole island. Like I look at some of the data, I was like, oh, 70%, what beach is it talking about? But I do restoration work in the Pali Coast, and in the Pali Coast there's a lot of sand places and really old spots, and you cannot even put a boat on the beaches there. And I don't see, I'm not there like every day like some of my friends are there, but I don't see massive changes happening on some of those coasts because nothing developed on it, so we didn't know where the line moves, where the sand's doing its thing. For me, I'm more focused on fish ponds, Aina-based systems, 600 to 800 year old structures. That is the data for me. So kind of like people ask like, oh, what are you doing to, what is that called? Project your restoration so that you can match data like what Mr. Fletcher is talking about. And personally, I tell them I don't see a lot of that happening in my line of work. I watch tides all the time because that's what the pond functions on. And then because we're in the river, now we got to deal with the restoration work. I'm not just watching the high tide, but I'm waiting for the jackpot time when you got a high with a flash flood. Then when that hits where we're at, then it's even higher than that high tide. So like we got to readjust to that level. But that happened twice already since the time we were at the fish pond 3 years ago. And we have a picture, but a section of that wall still stood on that the king tide and that flood, but it flooded everything else. But for me, I look at that wall where it's still protruding out of the stuff because that's as original as we can get. Like, I don't know, maybe that's 600 years old. So like, okay, if that's a spot there, I'm gonna run that line back and restore it to that level. I'm not gonna project yet because I want the future for do that. I don't wanna overstep my step within our time. Like we just get the footprint back, say, okay, we just saved a piece of our history that was 600 to 800 years old. So wait till the next 800 years. If the things start really going over, then let them adapt to that. So we don't overcompensate, because it's not cheap to get rock and rebuild a whole 2,700 foot wall. But just running off of the mo'olelo, matching the mo'olelo, look at what we do, and going through time, all the different changes that's been happening just within the past 130 years, from the illegal overthrow and the illegal occupation of America, and how much things have changed only in a short little period, 130 years. Like a lot of these homes only popped up within the past 100 years, but all of our mo'olelo span thousands of years, and there's a pattern in there. But again, going back to like what is actually happening, is it like more the fantasy of these certain places and how it's supposed to, we want it to think it's supposed to look, or are we really looking back at Mother Nature's patterns and just working with her and just adapting ourselves to it? But when you start building these kind of structures, we got everybody think permanent one time, it's going to be there forever. But
well, Jeff, you've got some of those structures that they do hope to be there for the long term. You think about the rain events that he's talking about and the freshwater issues that Dr. Fletcher was talking about. It's obviously not just the ocean, it's the freshwater as well. Interested to know what adaptations that you're making, to try to keep those structures in place, not just with sand replenishment, but, I know that, Dr. Fletcher and I have talked before tonight, and, there's this idea that maybe you lose the ground level of a high rise. Is that something that you would consider in some of the properties?
So I'm hoping we don't get to that point for sure. We don't want to lose any levels of the hotels. I think in that case, you've got water coming up into infrastructure, and that probably isn't the safest scenario for all of us. I think there's a lot of people working on beach replenishment in some of these resort areas today that make a lot of sense. I think there's the growing work. There's an EIS out there for Waikiki already that we believe makes a lot of sense for us to do. Then there's other discussions related to, I don't want to say into perpetuity because nothing is, but for beach replenishment on a nightly basis in that particular area. So there's a lot of discussions related to this.
On a nightly basis?
On a potential nightly basis. So each night you would pump a little bit of sand, put it into different locations within the beach so that on an ongoing basis we were able to address some of the beach erosion there. But I think that I'm really encouraged. To me, this is, if this was a business problem, we would say, what's the problem that we're dealing with and what's the plan that we come up with, and let's go execute on the plan, and how do you find funding for it? And so this debate has gone on for a long time, and it's time to figure out what are we going to do. And there's been, through the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, a climate coalition put together. And to me, that's what gives me some hope that we're starting to get some action. We're starting to get a group of individuals that are climate advocates, that are business individuals. You've got political leaders, all within the same group now, talking about solutions and how do we get to some of these solutions that we need to get out there, and then how are we going to deal with it. So I'm really encouraged that we're going to come up with solutions soon. I think we just all need to decide what we're going to do, and let's start with those plans soon.
If I could share a little bit more from the architect's perspective of things, because we're struggling with the same issues that Jeff Wagner is talking about at his properties. We are actually working with a number of different resort property managers in Waikiki and elsewhere, and looking ahead at these near-term things. The train isn't moving yet, so I heard what Dr. Fletcher said, and that train and the tracks. But Chris Conger had mentioned time frame. So if we're looking at a 5-year scheme for Outrigger, for example, or other resort properties, and what do you look at on a 5-year basis? What do you look on a 10-year basis? Could you do simple things to offset king tides, such as some flood proofing, constructing a sand berm if you do have a beach, and looking at near-term things? What's the next step? Maybe you're looking at some of those changes to your property on the Mauka side. So you have internal berms, things like that fit into the landscape, flood walls, things like that. So our architects are studying that full range of potentials with a 20-year and maybe even further horizon where, yes, that first floor, if the model projects as grimly as it is, well then, what are we doing? We're not abandoning Waikiki, okay? We're planners, we're architects, we're going to come up with great ideas, and we're going to have a beach in Waikiki. We're going to have buildings. Commerce will continue. We may have pumps running, but that's going to happen. So that first floor, if we have to, that cannot be an occupied space. That may have to become a common space. We can't retreat because there's no room on those campuses to move those hotels backwards. So what do? We work together. We're going to have to come up with solutions. There's a really dark scenario when Chip's train arrives, but we're in our lifetimes, I think we have to look at things incrementally, make sense, budget them, because these are sort of business and community decisions, and optimistically, as planners, we plan. We want to be positive about this, work together, and solve these.
Yunji?
Yes, please go ahead.
One thing I wanted to talk about is, and I touched on it earlier, but infrastructure. We keep talking about individual structures, and Tamara and I had this conversation earlier. I also work for the Board of Water Supply, and Dr. Fletcher is completely right. It is here. We get main breaks in Waikiki, we dig down, we're already in water. Alawai Boulevard, that far back, as Trinette is talking about, you're absolutely right. We can't just look at what's on the shoreline. We got to go back several hundred feet, yards even a mile, because you go into some places in Honolulu already, and it's already flooding when we have big king tides and stuff. So it's already here, and I appreciate the fact that we want to save our businesses and homes, but you better start thinking about the infrastructure too, because it's great to have a home. If you have no electricity, no telephone, no sewer, no water, it doesn't matter. So you really have to watch on that. And this young man has the right idea. He's working with Mother Nature. You are got the right idea.
You definitely make a good jumping board off right now, but like, it's not also just, is the question, is the water rising, but also like infrastructure, you know, like, if you look back to the 1700s, Captain Cook's diaries and what they wrote about that whole area. If we talk about Waikiki right now, all the way to Honolulu, what was there before anything got built? Does anybody know?
Wetlands.
Wetlands.
I just felt it more specific taro patches and fish ponds.
Right.
As far as the eye could see, way inland, way beyond where Waikiki is already developed now. So there's always water there. What did they have to do to get that dry? Backfill.
They
So they had
dredged
to
the
build
alawai,
up
they dredged the
every time.
alawai and the reefs, and they filled the land about
all
2 feet.
All those boat lanes, so they had to grab stuff to fill this wetland. So is things actually rising or water just taking its space back again?
Yeah.
You know, like that was 300, 400 years worth of that. And like just within the past 100 years, all these manipulations been happening, and then you're trying to keep that space again. Like, so in order to keep that space, there's a consequence. You're gonna have to work harder, you have to keep up with it, you have to keep going and going, and then whatever else is gonna start happening, you gotta keep up with that. Versus, yeah, just working with her and just driving and making it productive on the same space. And that place it's a beautiful story like that. That used to be pumping with food, now it's just pumping with buildings, you know, like.
Jeff, go ahead.
Yunji, we have this in a smaller scale in some of our international properties. So we can all look at the properties of the Maldives. These are not properties that are on huge islands. They're one property on a small atoll, little small island, and we deal with it every day. We have barges, we have replenishment of the beaches. The beaches are the same today that they were many, many years ago. And they're significantly closer from a water penetration or water coming over those islands than we have here in Hawaii. But that's how we deal with it. We don't have infrastructure issues at all in these properties in the Maldives or in Fiji. It's because we've taken action, we know what the plan is, and we're actually executing on it every single day. And I think for us, there's a piece of this that there's this massive debate going on, but we've got to do things to be able to shore this up. As Chip's talking about here, this is going to be on us relatively quick. I think we've seen in the last 5 years quite a bit of sea level rise and the water getting closer to homes and businesses. And it really is time that we do something. And I think we've shown in other locations in the world that you really can do something if you have a plan and you start to take some action.
I want to bring in this question for Dr. Fletcher. All of the discussion so far has been about solutions to erosion due to sea level rise. What about the cause, the climate itself? Is prevention even being considered? In the first question that I asked you, you seem to indicate that it's kind of too late.
No, it's never too late. We can't give up. We have to constantly work on this problem, but it is a long-term problem, and we've been too slow to react to it in terms of a global community cutting down on our use of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels have been a magnificent source of energy for humans going back 200 years. They have brought us health, extended lifetimes, but their time as a healthy form of energy ended many decades ago, and we should have been switching over to clean energy. We are actually at the beginning of a true global revolution in clean energy taking place this decade. For the first time last year, we saw as much money invested in clean energy as we saw invested in oil and gas around the world. It was the first time. And I won't drone on about this, but despite some truly wonderful steps currently being taken, we are still on a pathway of warming twice as much as we have already warmed. We're on a pathway of warming about 3 degrees centigrade.
So that's what I meant by too late. It's not that, of course, it's never too late for conservation.
Yeah.
Please don't take it in that way. But what I mean is the ocean is warming.
We can't stop sea level rise. We can slow it down, and we can prevent the very worst scenarios from taking place. But we have set in irreversible motion at this point on the order of 3 to 10 feet of sea level rise over the next 200 years. So we've set that in motion, and
Even
it's
if
irreversible.
we stop polluting tomorrow.
Even if we stop polluting today.
How much inches per year? Or centimeters?
We're talking about a
millimeters?
foot of sea level rise by 2050 compared to the year 2000, 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century, if the West Antarctic ice sheet doesn't dramatically collapse. And then we're up to 6 to 10 feet of sea level rise in the next century and the century after that.
Okay.
At what foot did you guys start seeing that rise start, where we could say from now to then?
We're talking about beginning the year 2000, so 23 years ago, 22 years ago.
Tamara, I see you wanting to jump in.
When he's talking about like 1 foot or 6 feet or 10 feet, like I feel like a lot of people in my community, at least, a lot of people that have moved here from the continent, in their mind they think 1 foot, oh, you know, but
doesn't seem like a big deal.
Doesn't seem like a big deal, but I think realistically it's 1 foot during like a 20-foot swell, during a king tide, during full moon, and then it grows exponentially. And to hear Mr. Overton and Mr. Wagner talk about planning for things, there's so many things that are outside of our control. You know, we had 2018 Hurricane Olivia and Hurricane Lane coming at us, category 5, you know, direct hit. We were expecting rain, and it in Lahaina it turned into a firestorm, you know. So I think it's more than the slow, steady rise of the ocean that you can plan for. It's those episodic catastrophic events that you cannot plan for, and it will set the economy back of the assessed value of these buildings, millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, and then the cleanup of that, you know. So I think with the population that is in these islands right now, there's a majority of them that don't understand what he's saying when he's saying 1 foot of sea level rise by 2050. That's not too bad. 1 foot, 12 inches, you know, but I think it needs to be explained more for the person that is not familiar with the ocean and what 1 foot or 3.2 feet or whatever that means in practical terms, and more extreme weather events and not being able to plan where it will hit or where is most vulnerable, or you think this area is like, we're good, you know, we're not on sand, but then category 5, we don't even have shelters for category 5. We don't, you know, so I mean, planning is good, but don't think you're in control.
I want to bring in this question over email. Chip, go ahead.
Here's a quick example of what's already happening. During the highest tides of the year, which occur around the end of the calendar year, December, January, and then again towards the end of the summer, during those highest tides of the year, if it rains, there's no gravity drainage in Waikiki, Kaka'ako, Iwalei, anywhere between Diamond Head and Pearl Harbor in the central urban corridor of Honolulu. There's no gravity drainage, which means we have to figure out how to pump the water out. We haven't even begun to discuss that as a community yet. Well, Miami Beach has. Miami Beach has spent $800,000 for a pump to pump the water out of half a block of roadway. $800K for half a block of pumpage when it rains at high tide. Stretch that over the length of Miami Beach or the primary urban core of Honolulu, you get up into hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep the place dry when it rains.
Wow.
The odds are pretty low that you have to hit the king tide with a good rain, because we've been trying to wait for that a lot. It's a jackpot. Like, to have that happen.
Exactly, yeah. I loved your term, the jackpot.
Yeah.
We call it a compound flood or a compound event.
I want to bring in this question, and Matt Weyer, maybe perhaps you're the one for this. Palani's saying, should the state or city invoke eminent domain laws to force homes off beaches to protect the beaches and the oceans? That's obviously very controversial. There are going to be people who refuse to move.
Yeah, very controversial. The conversation began, I think, this legislative session, and I think we're still waiting to see how the state's going to move forward with the one bill, at least, that I saw, putting funding aside for some of the homes up on North Shore. I know that the working group, part of what they found were that our plans worked best when they were voluntary, and so we want pathways, like I said before, for specific households, depending on their specific needs, to have options to move or deal with what they're confronting. eminent domain, exists as a mechanism, but I think that people have to remember that the government's required to pay, just compensation, right? And so if we're looking at, and again, talking about how this issue is going to grow, right? So it's going to continue to affect more and more homes. I don't think the cost of eminent domaining ourselves out of this problem is going to work. Doesn't mean that there aren't select sensitive spaces that we need to consider it if we want to turn parcels into parks or other recreational spaces where they're preserved for cultural access and public access. But no, I don't think eminent domain is a solution.
Lauren, I think we're all in agreement that this is a huge issue. What do you think is the best way out, given all the work that your group has done?
Well, got my personal opinion. But we'll keep it PC. No, one thing I wanted to bring up was adaptation pathways. I was very thankful that the county and the state were sitting in the room on our North Shore Coastal Resilience Working Group, and I saw action from you all. They have introduced, there's an active bill right now for managed retreat and creating a framework for that. And I think that's huge. We need that. We absolutely have to have that. That's one of the tools in our toolbox, right? We're all talking about this toolbox that we have. The other really interesting thing that I really want to see happen at the county and the state levels is what the city of Santa Cruz in California has done, is walk through this. It's called adaptation planning. And it's trigger based, right? A, it's community input, but then B, you have these triggers. So let's say, okay, in this particular section of beach, and we have the high wash of the wave hits X point, right? A specific point that triggers this action. And I think that would also help make it specific to the places and also create this community involvement and that community input. And then at the same time, you're able to, it doesn't feel just arbitrary. Lauren said, Surfrider said, Tamara said, it's that we hit this trigger and we all know as a community what happens when that trigger. This is what happens. And that could be maybe, in the short term, it's sand replenishment. Maybe it's a retreat in a specific area. Maybe those structures are taken away. Maybe it's groins, maybe there's something, but I would really, please state and county, let's find some funding so we can actually take on something like that. Santa Cruz has really, I think, in many successful ways, adopted that adaptation planning, and I think that's a really good next step.
John, you're here as a homeowner, and I'm just interested to know, I would think that if I had a home along the coast, managed retreat would sound pretty tough to me, and it would not be something that I would want.
Well, it's a rhetorical question for anyone, on the shoreline. It's not something they want. But I think a lot of shoreline, I know within our shoreline, is they recognize hardening doesn't work. It just hurts, and it hurts the neighbor next to you that doesn't have it. Managed retreat, and maybe some people will get upset as homeowners along the shore, but I think managed retreat in certain cases is going to be the only solution, whether we like it or not. And I believe, and I'd love to see the Army Corps of Engineers, I think they've done projects in Miami Beach and elsewhere where they do nourishment of the shoreline, and it seems to, and they have to replenish periodically, but there are possibilities out there. And my hope, and I think for those that are with me in this group, is that we have an opportunity to explore where we are, replenishing the beach. And so that's fingers crossed.
There's a question actually for you, Chris, that I want to bring in. Kimiona says, when sand is being mined from one place and put in others, there's a natural process to refill that space. Who is studying sand movement offshore? How do we know that we're not hurting environments offshore when we take that sand?
That's an excellent question. And there's actually been quite a bit of work done internationally and locally on what happens to those sand recovery areas. And we've got best practices for how to capture that sand and restore it to the beach. And looking at the layout on the seafloor, ocean currents and waves, you can actually design your recovery area to respond very quickly to restore itself back to the natural environment, to not create a big sinkhole that the rest of the near shore is filling back in, and to allow for reestablishment of microfauna and the native marine species that live in the area. So that actually went into the design process for, say, the Kaanapali project, and it's something that we studied extensively with the Waikiki projects. When we were recovering sand from there, we actually did quite a bit of microfaunal studies. We had marine biology before, during, and after. We had a year follow-up on those efforts, looking at not just how it responded right there in the areas where we took the sand, but in the reef that's adjacent to it and in control sites that were further away, and looking at the response of the areas that we impacted. And we do, and let me be clear, we do impact those when we recover sand from them, but they recover very quickly. And what we found was a year out, it was almost a complete recovery.
Ben from Kaneohe, Jeff Overton, I'd love for you to take this one. The state needs to step in. They need to put breakers 100 yards out, and they need to add groins. They've done it in Waikiki. It will work on the North Shore. I don't know if you know if it'll work on the North Shore, but we haven't talked a lot about groins tonight. I wonder if you would address that.
Well, I think there's a place for coastal structures where they fit. Each of these are going to be, as we talked about, the North Shore is a super high energy environment. So I can't speak to the effectiveness of coastal structures there. There are breakwaters in Haleiwa and places like that where they're protecting harbors, but to put them anywhere near, let's call our legacy beaches or the areas that have become world-renowned surf spots, kind of the reason I moved here was surfing. And I don't think most folks want to see that. Now, are there other places around the state, around this island, where structures have proven themselves? Yeah, we've talked about a few of those now. So breakwaters, of course, are usually around harbors and places. Would we start to think about them in places where we've seen erosion chronically, like Lanikai, Kahala, places like that? I think in place of a breakwater might be more of these small finger groins that could fit well into the environment, allow for sand capture in pockets, might not even need to do much replenishment in there, and they fit. You can see some older groins that were placed there historically, and they're fitting in nicely. They've kind of become part of our community. You see some off, say, the Outrigger Club in the Gold Coast and places like that. So I believe there's going to be a place for it, and in some of the projects that we've worked with to try to help homeowners that are losing their homes, we've even looked at sandbag groins, which could go in quickly, sort of cost effectively, and come out if it's not working out. So I think, again, temporally on scales, not thinking on a 50-year time horizon, but a 5 to 10-year time horizon, I think we really could add some of these in.
Tamara, I want to bring, or Trinette, sorry, I want to bring you in on this one because you talked about wetlands. It says, please discuss how we can use our wetlands and how we can expand this resource to mitigate shoreline damage. What do you think the role of wetlands and restoring wetlands is in all of this?
The restoration of wetlands, whether they're connected, well, they're all connected via the muliwai, right? So right there on that nearshore area. By restoring wetlands with native species that help to filter terrestrial runoff and silt, dirt, all of those kinds of things, chemicals. By caring for our wetlands and really getting the kinds of measurements, because there are some that have karsts underneath them, these underground like lava tube style things where salt water comes in through there, and there's such a dynamism, and it doesn't matter whether it's an estuarine wetland, whether it's one that's primarily dry for most of the year, and it only becomes wet during flood episodes or just periodic times throughout the year. But our wetlands not only help us with the watershed and terrestrial filtration, but they also can mitigate the way sand flows, the way the tides break on a specific beach when they are cared for, because natural berms are formed during some of the, alongside some of those areas, as in Waiʻohulikai and Waipuilani over on South Maui. These areas have seen natural accretion and depletion, and the more we've seen development on it, the less it's been able to do that, and that's one of the major functions for wetlands that are around the coastline. And so, you know, as I had mentioned earlier, we can't just look at structures and commercial entities. We need to really have a more holistic approach when we're looking at how we deal with coastal erosion and that mitigation, because wetlands play a very important part in that.
Michael Cain, I want to bring you in on this one. What are the plans for dealing with the erosion? Now, you don't have to answer this specifically, but it leads to something deeper, which is, what are the plans for dealing with the erosion on Kamehameha Highway in Ka'ava? You have the benefit of getting to see all of these areas, you know, in time, of course, but we talked a little bit about infrastructure and those issues. You know, other than the homes, we see the roads really being impacted quite a bit. Tell us about that.
That's a critical issue. It's actually the State Department of Transportation that is preparing an EIS to look at long-term plans for protecting the highway. We've been involved in working with them on emergency permits. And for us, so our kuleana is to protect the state's natural and cultural resources. And we know that throwing in revetments will damage those resources. But we also need to recognize that we can't lose the highway, that will hurt a lot of people.
So do we move the highway?
I would love to do that, but I don't have that power to do that. So it's been, I've got to say reluctantly, like the best choice we've had is to issue permits for rock revetments along the highway, knowing that that impacts the beaches, and I don't have a better answer.
Yeah, you know, we've seen this on the North Shore too. Kathleen, I want to ask you, you know, we've seen this on the North Shore where, you know, you have the beaches right there, and eventually you feel like, okay, we've got to move this inland a little bit. What are those discussions like?
Well, again, like what's happening in Ka'ava, there's not a whole lot of places to go, you know, because you have buildup on both sides. There are some areas in the North Shore around Lāʻie. I know DOT is going to be moving the highway over a bit. That's not so much due to coastal erosion as it is to traffic and tourism, but it will help by moving the road in. But that's not an option in most of the area of the coastline. You can't really move the road because there's no place to move the road. So again, we go back to all the other options about retreat and different things to do. You know, to try and get people to figure out how to handle the issue. Going back to the earlier question about, you know, building groins and stuff on the North Shore, Jeff is right. I think you'd have quite a revolution or uproar if people try to put stuff because of the surf. You're going to affect the surf. Not just the boat, but, you know, as we've been talking about, you can't separate the land from the ocean. You can't separate the wetlands. It's all one. Which Peleke gets, he understands that it's all one. You can't separate it. And that's part of our thinking is I think we try to like put things into boxes. And, you know, so I don't have an answer for the road, but it's again, we can't have to look at it holistically. Like
around the question of the road, I just wanted to maybe balance off Michael's responses. We've actually worked for private homeowners, 7 together, who tried for 3 years, did all the studies, and in the end got denied, and yet DOT came out with an emergency permit right next door basically and got to dump, you know, upwards of a quarter mile of rocks. Now we know we need to save the highway for life safety and commerce, but when you have private property owners that essentially don't have a beach there and were denied the ability to protect their properties, we're building the same sort of structure. There's not equity in this situation. Really, for the small guy, people vilify private property owners, I think wrongly, in the media. They're not all bad actors. We actually don't work for bad actors, but it's not really fair for the person who owns a piece of property to then see the highway department come in and dump a 5-foot stack of rocks. We know we need it, but let's use private funds with a good design and do the same thing and have real property tax at the same time. There's an answer here, and we have to study each of these individually. One size doesn't fit all with these regulations.
You know,
we
Chip,
talked about,
Chip, we only
sorry.
have a few minutes left. I just want to ask you, because, you know, there is disagreement on this panel, of course, but there is, you know, we all want the experience that you talked about that touched her heart and mine too, as a mother of 2 small children. The idea that our children learn at the beach, they experience Hawaii. It is the best of what we have here. Can Hawaii be the way we enjoy it long term? Do we have to give it up?
Oh no, we don't have to give it up. And yes, it can be the way that we ourselves enjoy it and the way that our grandparents enjoyed it. But there is a very practical issue here. And on the one hand, where we have beautiful beaches, I think we need to work hard to preserve them. We still have lots of beaches here. Let's protect them. There are other places where roads are the most important issue because entire communities rely on them, and there aren't beaches in front of those roads. So finding the solutions here that balance the equilibrium that exists today in a way that can project it into the future under higher levels of sea level rise is one way to go. I'm talking at 60,000 feet here. And this panel, this wonderful panel, has been a real exercise in detailed discussion. But we have to be optimistic. There are solutions. We're all committed to the same thing. We have incredible commonalities. We're all on the same page. We recognize the problem. We have the full capacity to work this out, and I'm sure we will. We can be very optimistic about this.
Well, that gives me a lot of hope. Peleke, we've got about a minute left. I'd love for you to have the last word. Given everything that's been said tonight, what path forward do you see?
And more in the Mother Nature vibe. Well, I always say, Nalu, just be like the ocean, and Nalu is waves, and whenever that wave start breaking, we ride them the best we can. Yeah, it's always going to be moving. We cannot be stuck to one thing the whole time. We're on a little island in the middle of the ocean, and if you like be an unhappy person, you got to move with the aina. If not, you're going to be fighting them for the rest of your life. Yeah.
So in your mind, what does that look like? Does that look like we leave the shoreline? Does it look like we manage retreat, you know?
Yeah, something's going to have to give because a lot has been forced upon for a long time. So it's like finding that balance is one. But it's either the people's going to lose out or the industry's going to lose out. I'm not sure. Like, got to find that balance. Back to the drawing board.
Well, we've heard a lot of wonderful ideas tonight. We appreciate all of you for being here. This, of course, is a complicated issue, one we will not solve tonight, but we bring together key stakeholders and experts to push this issue forward because it is one that we as a community have to face whether we want to or not. Mahalo to all of our guests and to those of you at home who participated with all of these great questions for being part of our discussion. We will be back next month for another KΑKOU to talk about the new reality of concealed carry in Hawaii. Hundreds of local residents have applied for permits to carry guns when they leave home. Should the government restrict where they can go? State and local lawmakers have some thoughts, and we're guessing you do too. We hope you join us then. I'm Yanji Denise. Until next time, aloha.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station. from viewers like you. Thank you.